Okay. Um, we're going to talk about two things in this Parsha of Naso, even though there's more than that. It starts off with Nazir, and we're not going to discuss that one this time. But we are going to talk about Sotah. And the reason being is because although Sotah was this temple ritual, and in fact, historically, it was discontinued during the Second Temple period. Um, we've always said that if a ritual, especially a symbolic ritual, is presented in the Torah, it has some eternal meaning to it. There's a value to it. It's not just something that happened in the ancient times and has no relevance. So we're going to talk about its detail and then end up by discovering, as it were, what its underlying eternal message is and why it's preserved in the Torah, even though there isn't in the historical record, Talmudic record, there isn't any record of actually doing this. In other words, actually carrying it out, just like in many other things, there's no evidence of carrying out things like
Pakistan.
Ben Sora and Mora um, and other things, but that's irrelevant. The point is, it's presented in order to teach us something. And in many cases, as we'll see, those things that are presented are intentionally to be seen in contrast with what everybody else was doing, all the other cultures at the time, to show you the unique value system of the Torah. And then we're going to, after we go through that, then we're going to switch over to an entirely different subject, the Birkat Kohanim, and see what that's about to make, and that we do. We do that nowadays. If you go to shul, you'll see Birkat Kohanim in all Tefillah Shacharit and in Shabbat Shacharit and Musaf, and that that needs to have meaning to it when we experience it. So, the first one is not relevant as a ritual nowadays, but the second one is very much relevant in that we experience Birkat Kohanim every time we daven Shacharit, and also we use Birkat Kohanim if you have children or grandchildren on Friday night. You use the brachot of Birkat Kohanim for your children and grandchildren. So it's good to understand what it is that you're blessing. So we'll do both of those things. All right, let's start with this ritual, a situation of a sotah. Okay, we'll I was going to do the Hebrew first, but that takes too long. So let's just take a look at the English and go through it. And then we'll go back over. I'll use an example, a more modern example of it. We'll go back over it and then analyze it. So this is the way it's presented in the fifth chapter of Bamidbar. Uh, Hashem says to Moshe, "Speak to the Bnei Israel. If a man's wife goes astray, that's what the word sotah means. Sisteh means to go astray, and is unfaithful to him." So now it's giving you the first situation in which the woman actually is guilty of being unfaithful. So if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, so that another man has sexual relationships with her, so in other words, it's an adulterous relationship, and this is unbeknownst to her husband. In other words, he doesn't know this happened, and her impurity is kept secret. In other words, it's called tuma. In other words, she's spiritually impure, and that which makes her spiritually impure is kept secret, meaning there's no witnesses against her, and she hasn't is not a case of rape where she's forced, but it's a willing adulterous relationship. So the Torah continues. So what happens if she actually does have a relationship? There isn't anybody who sees it, but the husband suspects it. So the Torah continues. If feelings of jealousy come over her husband and he suspects his wife, and in fact she is guilty of adultery, or second scenario, he is suspicious and jealous, but she is not guilty. In other words, she didn't do anything. So this is the case that we're talking about. It's the second case that we're talking about, is that he suspects his wife of having an adulterous relationship, but there's no evidence. Okay, and she didn't do it. Okay, so here's the situation. He thinks she did. She may or may not have. And so this ritual comes into effect. He has to take his wife to the Kohen in the Mishkan. The Kohen shall bring her and have her stand before God. So now, she is told that what's happening next is going to be in God's presence. So she best tell the truth. Then he shall take some of Mayim Chayim, some water, and put it in a clay jar, and then take some dirt from the Mishkan floor, put it in the jar, and mix it up. So it comes. There's like water that has some dirt in it. After the Kohen has had the woman stand before God, he shall loosen her hair. The term is tifret. In other words, women typically, married women wore their hair in braids, and so the Kohen would undo the braid and let the hair hang loose, which was not considered sniut, and place her hands in her hands an offering, a grain offering. It's a korban that's brought for this situation when the husband is suspicious, while he himself holds the bitter water that brings a curse. The Kohen holds this little jar of water, and the woman holds this grain offering in front of her. And then the Kohen puts the woman under oath, and then he says to her, if no other man has had sexual relationships with you, in other words, you haven't done anything wrong, and you have not gone astray and become tameh, spiritually impure, while married to your husband, may this bitter water that brings curse potentially not harm you. In other words, nothing is going to happen when you drink this water. But if you have, in fact, gone astray while married to your husband, and you have, in fact, made yourself tameh by having sexual relationship with a man other than your husband, in other words, you have, in fact, in secret committed adultery, here the Kohen is to put the woman under curse and say, may God cause you to become a curse among your people, and may he make you miscarry in the future and your abdomen swell. And then the woman has to say, Amen, okay, I agree to this condition. Then the Kohen is to write these curses on a piece of parchment and dissolve it into the water in the jar, and he shall make the woman drink the bitter water that brings a curse, and this water that brings a curse and causes bitter suffering will enter her. In other words, she has to drink the water. If she has made herself impure, and in fact has been unfaithful to her husband, this will be the result. When she is made to drink the water that brings a curse and causes bitter suffering, it will enter her, her abdomen will swell, and her womb will miscarry, and she will become a curse. If, however, the woman has not made herself impure, but as clean of sin, she has done nothing wrong, she will be cleared of guilt, and she will retain the ability to have children in the future. This then is the law of kina, of sotah, of jealousy, when a woman goes astray and makes herself impure while married to her husband, or when feelings of jealousy come over the man because he suspects his wife, but in fact she wasn't guilty. The husband will be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the woman will bear the consequences of her sin. Then the woman is the one who is punished. Okay, so that's the way it's presented in the Torah. All right, so now we're going to analyze what's happening and see what the meaning is of all this ceremony. So I propose a modern example. So consider this it's hypothetical, but consider it as an example of a modern day Sotah situation. A married woman is working in a downtown office. She becomes quite friendly with a male co-worker, and the two spend much time together socially. Soon, the husband believes that his wife's social relationship with this co-worker violates his exclusive rights. I put that in quotes because that is Hirsch's a translation of the word kina. Instead of using the word jealousy, he translates it associated with the word, the kina is kuf nun aleph, and he's associating it with the phonetically similar word kuf nun he, which means to acquire something. When you buy something, koneh, liknot. When you buy something, you acquire the exclusive rights. And so he says, in a marriage, the partners, the two partners, acquire their exclusive rights to each other. So that's what it means. And it's not jealousy meaning sort of an emotion that could be paranoid. It means that he believes that she has violated the marital vow of each having exclusive rights to each other in marriage and not having any rights to have any relations with people outside the marriage. So, in the presence of two witnesses, now here's the important part. In the presence of two witnesses, he forbids his wife to be alone with this man from now on. Now, this is Torah Sheba'al Peh. In other words, this is not evident in the text itself, but this is the way the rabbis analyze the situation and turn it into a halakhic description. So at this point, when the man is suspicious of the social relationship between his wife and this other coworker, so in the presence of two witnesses, he says, "I don't want you to be alone with this man from now on." She, however, ignores his warning, and a few days later, the wife and her co-worker are seen by others entering a nearby hotel during lunchtime. Two witnesses observe them registering at the desk and entering a hotel room, but that's it. That's all they observe. I put into brackets, if the story continue with even one witness barging into the room and finding them in an adulterous union, that's the end of the marriage. The marriage would be dissolved. It's considered adultery by witness, and this is not the case of a sotah. In other words, that's if there's witnesses that she actually committed adultery, then this whole sotah thing does not apply. Okay, follow it so far? Everybody, yes? Okay. Now, let's review the situation. There were two separate witnessed events. First, the husband explicitly forbade his wife to be alone with this man. And second, the wife and her companion were in fact secluded together, and there are no witnesses to anything that happened. That's the situation. Okay, so there are two separate things here. As our illustration continues, the husband confronts his wife with the witnessed report of her hotel foray. In other words, he said, two people we know saw you go into that hotel. She admits to entering the hotel, but insists that nothing happened, that they spent time talking and did not engage in any kind of adulterous union. So now, what should the husband think? Because in this situation that I described, which is the Gomorrah's situation, she ignored his warning, and so can he trust her statement? If she ignored the warning and she said, oh, don't worry, nothing happened, can he trust that? What happens in this marital relationship? In other words, can this be resolved? Can the situation be resolved? He told her he didn't want the two of them to be together. There are witnesses that they were together in this hotel room. She claims nothing happened. And so that's where it stands. How can this marital relationship be resolved? Can something determine whether she's telling the truth or not? This is the case of Sotah. This entire procedure, we're taking a pause for a minute and then we'll come back to it. This entire procedure of trial by ordeal, another having some ritual which is used to determine truth or not truth, is found in the pagan codes of law, in the contemporary codes. Hammurabi talks about it, Mari talks about it, Hittite laws talk about it. But our question is, why would the Torah also have this kind of a ritual? In other words, to have a ritual to determine the truth would be similar to the pagan rituals, and why would the Torah adopt a similar kind of ritual? And here we have to go back to what we've said many, many times, having to do with other laws that the Torah wants to bring in order to contrast it to what everybody else was doing. So you remember when we talked about slavery, we showed that Hammurabi and the Hittite laws all treated humans as property. They weren't human beings with rights. Humans were considered chattel. Slaves were considered property. And you can treat your slave as you would any other property that you had. So you can beat a slave, you can injure a slave, you can kill a slave if you want. You can do all of that because they're not humans. They're just property. The Torah comes in and says, no, when somebody is in a relationship of servitude with you, whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew, you have no right to harm that person physically. You can't hurt them. If indeed you do injure them, they go free. And you have a limited time in which they can serve you. Then after 6 years, they have to go free and they have to try over again. You have to let them go. In other words, you can't oppress other human beings. So here the Torah is presenting the laws of slavery in the Torah, not because slavery is a good thing, but because it wants to contrast it to the values that you're seeing in all the other codes of how they treat slaves. Similarly, when we talked about the Ir Miklat, when somebody kills somebody else accidentally or unintentionally, according to the other codes, if you remember, there's what's called vicarious punishment. Remember, we gave the example: if a builder, a kablan, builds a house for somebody, and he was negligent, and the roof falls in and kills the son of the homeowner, then according to all the other codes, the son of the kablan gets killed. In other words, you kill the child of the kablan, just as the homeowner's child was killed by the negligence of the kablan. Okay, we don't do that at all. Okay, there's no such thing as vicarious punishment. There is only punishment to the person who committed a crime. And similarly to the whole idea of a goel dam, a blood avenger, we have a court that intercedes and doesn't allow the blood avenger to just kill somebody who accidentally was killed. So it's another contrast to what everybody else was doing. And we didn't analyze it, but the situation of the Ben Sora Amora, the rebellious son, is contrasted to the patriarchal society of other cultures where the father had complete control over his son. So if his son disobeyed or was impolite or was chutzpahdik to the father could kill him, either send him away, sell him as a slave, or kill him. And in the Torah system, the father does not have any of those powers. The parents have to take the kid to a court, and the court, a family court, discusses the whole situation with the family and deals with it in order to resolve the family issue, and they don't allow the father to have the power to personally punish his own child. And this is another case. In the case of a suspected adulteress, the Sotah case, in all other codes, the husband had complete power and control over the wife. So however the husband saw it, that's the way it was. And he could have his wife killed. He could throw her out of the house. He could sell her as a slave. He could do what he wants. He had complete power. And in our system, the husband does not. He has to take her to the Kohen. And it's the Kohen that deals with this issue, not him. So in all of the ancient Near East codes, adultery was a sin against the gods as well as the spouse, but there was no trial. Either the husband had two options. He can either accept a monetary compensation. He can go to the in-laws and say, I think your daughter has been unfaithful and I could kill her. And if you don't want me to kill her, then pay me off. Or he can just order that his wife be put to death. That's the power that the husband had in all of the other ancient Near East codes. In our situation, adultery is in fact also a sin against God and a sin against the spouse, but the case is referred to a court or to the Kohen for determination, and it needs witnesses. If guilty, then it's considered a capital offense, and both adulterous parties, here's where your issue is, Rose, both adulterous parties, and they are both considered adulterous, the man and the woman, and there is no option of monetary compensation, no matter how rich the in-laws are, you can't buy them off. If there are no witnesses, then there's no court trial, and then you have to have this Sotah ritual. Okay, this is how we handle it. We don't allow the husband to determine the outcome of the wife's guilt. In the Hammurabi, this is the Hammurabi's code. If a man's wife was accused, but she was not caught lying with another, in other words, he just is suspicious, and that's it. She shall make an oath by the god and return oath. So she's allowed to go to the temple and swear that nothing happened by the god, and she can return home, but it's up to the husband of what he wants to do. If a finger has been pointed at the man's wife, in other words, if somebody else says to the husband, I think your wife is being unfaithful, and she was not caught lying with him, but there's no witnesses that in fact she was. So in those codes, she has to jump into a river for the sake of her husband. In other words, the husband has the right to ask that she jump into a flowing river from a bridge. If she drowned, it showed that the river gods deemed her guilty, but if she swam to safety, she was innocent. So it all depended, A, on one, can she swim? B, B, how rough the waters were, how fast the river currents were, whether she was jumping in to rocks or water. In other words, all of that was irrelevant to the situation. She had to jump off a bridge, and whatever happened to her happened to her. If she died, that meant she was guilty. If she somehow survived, then it was deemed that she was innocent.
Isn't that a bit like when they used to duck the witches?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And I think they got it from here. In the Mari codes, she had to leap into a river in either case. In other words, she couldn't make an oath and return home like the Hammurabi codes. In this case, they threw a servant into the river first and showed the woman how the servant would drown in order to get a confession from her. So if she didn't know how to swim and she saw that somebody else drowned, it, she would be smart if she evoked a confession. Of course, if she did evoke a confession, then she'd be killed anyway. I mean, this is the way the system went. And this is what the Torah now has completely voided and presented an entirely different paradigm. Here, if a man's wife was accused by the husband and she was not caught, there's no witnesses, in our case, she has to be taken to the Kohen for this bitter water ritual. An oath is not an option. In other words, you have to look at this psychologically, what's happening. And she can't, like in the Hammurabi's code, you make a oath in front of the god. Well, even if she swore in God's name that nothing happened, the husband wouldn't believe it. Why? Because she was warned before not to be found in together with the other guy in hiding, and she ignored that warning. So why should he believe her? So her oath wouldn't fix anything. In other words, even if she swore, "Oh, I didn't do anything," there's no reason for the husband to believe her because she didn't tell the truth the first time. There's no provision for a third party accusing the wife. In other words, in our system, it's only the husband who can accuse the wife, and there's no, it's this whole Sotah thing is not affected because of community gossip, because uh, somebody else was telling stories to the husband. That doesn't that doesn't count in our system. There's no possibility of a death penalty, regardless. In other words, no matter what, even if she is guilty, there's no death penalty, only a measure for measure, which is a divine consequence of sterility if she's guilty. Her life is never at risk. I don't know if you all saw that movie about 15 years ago called The Stoning of Soraya M. It was a movie, a very unsettling movie of how the Muslims deal with this case. In that movie, the husband was married to somebody who was quite wealthy, and he made poor investments, and he was broke. So he decided the way that he can get her money is accuse her of being adulterous. Then he could kill her, and he can inherit her money. So that's what he did. He paid off two witnesses to lie to the court and to say, we saw her commit adultery with this other man, which was a complete lie. They were just paid to say that. And there's nothing she could do about it. And so they took her out and they stoned her, and she was killed. Okay, that's the way they handled it. And our system is, in the biblical system, is entirely different. There's no such thing as that. Now, here we get to Rose's issue. Is this case fair? What is to stop the husband's abuse of power? His jealousy may be his own delusion with no basis in reality, and he has the power to put his wife through this humiliating ritual. Is that fair? In other words, let's say he was paranoid. Let's say he was a possessive husband, and yes, he was jealous, he was suspicious, but it was all in his mind. Is it fair that he could put his wife through this humiliating ritual? Okay, but in fact, remember the story that I told you. The way the Gemara presents it, even though the Torah doesn't go into this detail, that this only applies if he already warned her in front of two witnesses not to be alone with this guy, and she ignored the warning. So in fact, it's not that he put her through this, she chose to put herself in a situation in which she would have to go through this humiliating ritual of having her hair uncovered and be seen as somebody who is um, not innocent until proven guilty, but kind of guilty and proven until proven innocent.
It seems that they both want to get back together in a way because
Okay, so wait, we'll get there. So if she is guilty, and here is Rose's issue, what about the other guy? It appears that he gets away with his crime of adultery. In other words, the one who she was with in this hotel room. And what if the husband is also guilty of adultery? What if he plays around in secret with another married woman? In other words, he was having an affair. Is there no consequence for him? Only his accused wife. So all these brought up, and the Gemara addresses these. The Gemara realizes that this is unfair unless these things are addressed.
And Steve, how about also who these witnesses are? That also is very key.
No, but the witnesses haven't done anything wrong. The witnesses are just there when the husband says, "I just want you to hear that I'm telling my wife she can't be alone with this guy." So that's their whole role. They didn't do
No,
anything.
I understand what you're saying, but they could be very, very much siding with him, seeing things from his perspective, anything.
No. If in the case that I presented you, the witnesses are only giving testimony that he warned her. That's the
Okay.
only testimony. That's the only.
Okay.
They're not saying that they saw anything or anything more than that. That's their entire role is to acknowledge the fact that he warned her. That's all. Otherwise, they have no power to do anything else. Okay. So if this is seen as not a case of clear adultery because there's no witnesses. Therefore, this is not a case for a court. This doesn't go to a court. This goes to the Kohen. The husband will always doubt his wife's faithfulness in this scenario. In other words, given the situation that I presented, there's no way to resolve his doubt. He warned her. She denies anything. She admits that she was alone with him, this other guy, but she said nothing happened. Okay, so it's one person's word against the other person's word, and it's you can't resolve it. But here is a marriage in which this suspicion can never be resolved, and this directly affects offspring and family life because there's no resolution. In other words, the husband in the future can say, "Oh, this kid that you just had 9 months after this event, is it my kid or is it the other man's kid?" He'll never know. Remember, there's no DNA. He'll never know, and it ruins the faithfulness of the couple forever in this relationship, and that's the point of this ritual, because the only one who can actually determine the truth is God. That's what this ritual is saying. The only thing that the only way to resolve this marriage and resolve the husband's doubt is only if God does it. So the Torah's objective is to resolve the doubt that cannot be resolved in any other way and preserve the marriage. That's the point. This is what the Torah wants to teach, that this whole Sotah thing that's done according to the Torah's system and ritual is for the purpose of preserving the marriage. It's not for the purpose of supporting the husband. It wants to preserve the marriage, and the marriage can be preserved by the truth. Now, once the truth is determined, then there's a follow-up. Okay, the ordeal does not require an innocent woman to be shamed by loosening her hair, but in other words, this is not unfair to her by shaming her before it's determined whether she's telling the truth or not. But the ritual says, yes, you do really have the consequence of being shamed because she acted immodestly and brazenly by ignoring an explicit witnessed warning. You see, in other words, regardless of whether she really did commit adultery or not, she is guilty of something. She's guilty of ignoring the explicit warning of the husband. So she acted immodestly by going into this hotel room with this guy, regardless of what happened. So, in fact, her being publicly shamed is for the first thing. And it doesn't have to do whether she's guilty or not guilty of adultery. At any point, according, again, this is the Torah Shebaal Peh that's giving you all the legal details. If either party wishes to dissolve the marriage by divorce, then the ritual is stopped. In other words, it's not carried out. And if the woman dissolves the marriage, if she says, okay, I don't want to go further, I want a divorce, so she can do that, but she doesn't get her ketubah. In other words, she doesn't get the money that comes with a divorce. But if the husband initiates the divorce before it's determined whether she's guilty or not, so he does pay the ketubah. In other words, if the couple says, I don't care what happens, I don't want the truth to come out one way or the other, I just want to dissolve this marriage, I want a divorce, they can do it before the end of the ritual. Two added clauses. The rabbis noted that if she is proven guilty, the man she committed the crime with is affected in the same manner. In other words, the man is also punished through this ordeal, and just as she can have no children, he can have no children. This brings the consequence in line with judicial adultery, in which both parties are equally punished. So that answers your question. He is punished just like she is punished if she, in fact, is guilty.
Do we know if that ever happened?
What?
Do we know if that ever happened?
No, there's no case. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's no case in which the Talmud describes this actually happening. It's all theoretical law, but it's to teach you. It's to teach you the idea of fairness and justice. Also, if the husband had ever committed a forbidden sexual act, in other words, if he ever committed adultery himself, as the consequence of the ordeal was not actuated. In other words, nothing happened. Even if she was guilty in this case, nothing would happen because there's equality under the law. In other words, he can't get away with an extramarital affair and she is punished. Right? So if he ever had an extramarital affair, then nothing will happen to her when she drinks the water, even if she's guilty. So again, the husband wouldn't want her to have this ordeal because he knows that it's not going to result in him learning anything new because nothing is going to happen because he is guilty of the same crime. So what are the values taught by this ritual? First of all, women are not to be treated as property, but as human beings with human rights. In other words, the husband can't ask her parents for compensation to pay him off so that he doesn't bring her to the Kohen for this ritual. There's no such thing in Judaism as violating justice by paying off something. Husbands do not have the abusive power over their wives. The community court, in other words, the family court, or the ritual deals with these matters. In other words, the husband doesn't have this power over the wife, just like he didn't have this power over the son on the Ben Sora Umora situation. He can't do what he wants. He has to bring the issue to a court and deal with it openly in a just way. The goal of the ritual is not punishment, but the goal of the ritual is reconciliation. The whole purpose is that the only way to dispel the husband's
Jealousy.
feeling of jealousy is through showing that she's not guilty, and it's God who is determining, because God is the only one who can say she's not guilty. And the guilt of the adulterer in both parties suffer the same consequences, which is equality under the law that we just said. And husbands can't accuse their wives of the same sins of which they themselves are guilty. That if they had extramarital affairs, they can't accuse their wife and have her go through this ritual because that's not equality under the law. So even though this ritual is most likely never carried out, the point is that there are values about justice, values about treatment of husbands and wives that are taught through analyzing what this ritual is and what its purposes are, what the outcomes are, and how it demonstrates equality under the law and a sense of justice. So that's our purpose of the ritual. Okay, any questions on that before we go quickly to the Kohanim? Okay. So let's skip to an entirely different subject that's presented in our Parsha, the Birkat Kohanim. And here, because we witness it, we have to see how come they still do it. Remember, this was a temple ritual. And once there's a temple that was destroyed, all rituals in the temple are not done anymore. We don't do sacrifices anymore. We don't do the Yom Kippur thing anymore with the two Seirim. In other words, all temple rituals don't continue. So how come the Birkat Kohanim continues? And it's based on the text itself. Let's see. It says, Bo'etahi, this is in Devarim. Bo'etahi hivdil Hashem et shevet HaLevi, laseit et Aron berit Hashem, that God gave the rights of taking care of the Mishkan to the Levi. He took it away from the firstborns. Remember, the firstborns were the ones who were supposed to do this, but because of the golden calf incident, they lost that right. And Levi the tribe of Levi was chosen to be the ones who serve in the Mishkan and later in the Mikdash. La'amod lifnei Hashem, and then it says, ulevarech bishmo ad hayom hazeh, and to bless in God's name even to today. You see, that's why they keep it, because the Torah itself says, even if there's no temple anymore, you still retain the Birkat Kohanim ad hayom hazeh, even without a temple. And then it also in Devarim, about 10 chapters later, it says, "V'nigshu haKohanim b'nei Levi, kivam bachar Hashem Elokecha l'shor tov." the Levim are chosen to do the service, ulevorech b'shem Hashem. The second thing that they have to do is to bless in God's name. Now it says B'nai Levi, it means Aharon, who is a Levi. He's the priest. Very often they're referred to Kohanim B'nai Levi because the Kohanim are within the tribe of Levi. So it's the Levitical priests, meaning the family of Aaron, which shall come forward and to pronounce the blessing in God's name. So here, back in our Parsha, this says how it's done. God says to Moshe, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, Yivarechacha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Sa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem shalom. Those are the words, those are the blessings. Thus they will put my name, says God, onto the Israelites, and I will bless them. That's critical. In other words, the Kohanim have no power to bless people, unlike the Christian situation in which priests themselves have the power to bless. In our system, the priests have no power to bless us, but rather the blessing goes through them. They're the conduit of God's blessing to the Bnei Israel. So they have to pronounce it, but God is the one who's blessing. Notice the first and last verse, which bracket the blessing, make it quite clear. While the priests are articulating the scripted blessing, they have to say these words, it is God who is actually blessing the people. And if we look on how it's done, we can see how it's done in the shul now. In Vayikra, when Aaron did the blessing the first time, it says he lifted his hands towards the people and he blessed them. He had done the sacrifices first, and then he stepped down from where he was on a duchan, on a platform, and it says, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. So we in the shul do what's based on this pasuk. First of all, the Kohanim stand on a platform. They stand in front of the Aron Kodesh on a raised area. Of course, if there's no raised area, they stand in front of the Aron on the floor, but ideally, they stand on some kind of a raised area. They remove their shoes because that's what Kohanim did in the temple. And so the Kohanim remove their shoes in the shul when they bless us. They lift their hands. They face the people. Remember, they turn around. They make the bracha and they turn around and face the people. And then they have to say these exact words in Hebrew. They can't do it in any other language. It has to be in Hebrew, and it has to be the exact quote, word for word, in a loud voice. And that's why the Chazan says the word first, and they repeat it word for word in a loud voice. That's what Aaron and the Kohanim did, and that's what they have to do. Why do they go up to the Duchan after Ritzei, when the Chazan is at Ritzei? Because Ritzei refers to the avodah of the temple service, and you see in the first pasuk on top, when it says that he had already sacrificed the offerings. So once the offerings are mentioned in the paragraph of Ritzei, that's when it's their cue to come up to the platform and then bless the people like Aharon did in the initial blessing. The rabbis added that they have to recite a blessing. Aaron didn't have to recite a blessing, but they do, and they say that we are blessing the people because we are doing it, and then we are representative of Aaron and his offspring as Kohanim, and they cover their hands, and we generally don't look at them directly for two reasons. Number one is that they are not blessing us. So we don't want to look at their face as if they're blessing us. And second, at the time of the temple, God's presence shone through the fingers of the Kohanim, which is why they spread their fingers, or sort of to allow illumination to go through. And they covered their hands, and we cover we look down, we don't look directly at them as a commemoration of God's presence. But more in our day and age, we don't look at the Kohanim because we want to make sure that we understand consciously that it's not the Kohen that's blessing us. It's not the person up there that's blessing us, but it's God blessing us through the Kohanim. What's the bracha? Yivarechacha Hashem v'yishmerecha. There is going to be 3 brachot, and each are going to refer to a different dimension. May God bless you and preserve you. When we say God bless, if we look at all the places that God blesses people in the Chumash, especially in Bereshit, the Avot, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, whenever it says God bless them, it refers to material blessing. God gave them fertility, God gave them wealth, God gave them safety. In other words, God gives you what it is you can't get for yourself. That's God's blessing. And it's not enough that God just blesses us with this material blessing, with all these brachot, but v'yishmerecha means we ask God, or God is telling us to preserve the blessing. In other words, not only do we get the blessing, but we want to preserve it. We want to keep it. If God is blessing us with material good or with children and grandchildren, we want to keep that blessing. So we ask God to bless and keep that blessing. May God give you your material needs that you have no control over. In other words, we cannot have control over our own fertility and our own nachas that we get from our kids. These are not things we can make. They are material blessings that we get. And we ask God to allow us to enjoy them. Our health, our economic security are all material blessings. The second one is not material. The second one is intellectual. The term Ya'er Hashem Panav, may God's face illuminate us. Illumination is an intellectual bracha. When God sends his countenance, his face shines on us, means God's illuminating us with the knowledge of the Torah, vichuneka, and grace us with the ability to understand what it is that God is illuminating us. You say in the first bracha of the Shemona Esrei, Ata chonein la'adam da'at, umelamed le'enosh binah, chaneni mi'itcha deya bina v'haskel. In other words, grant us knowledge and understanding and the ability, our intellectual capacity. Baruch atah Hashem chonein hadat. Chonein means grants us the ability to appreciate this intellectual knowledge. So it's may God illuminate you and be gracious to you to allow you to absorb and understand the teachings that God wants to communicate to you. And this, by the way, if you think about it, is what when you do Birkat Banim, when you're Friday night blessing your children or your grandchildren, this is what you're wishing, that they learn, that God teach them his teachings and that they understand them and they absorb them. So may God grant you his knowledge and grace you with the ability to understand and appreciate that knowledge. And the third one is an overall one. Yisa Hashem panav elecha. May God look with favor on you. Now this is an idiom. Yisa Hashem panav, lift his face, is an idiom that comes from the Torah elsewhere. It's in Bereshit. Anybody remember where that phrase comes from? Yisa panim. It was in the story of Yaakov meeting Esav for the first time and being scared stiff that Esav is going to attack him because of the birthright 20 years before. And so he sends him all kinds of gifts. Remember, he sends messengers with all kinds of cattle and sheep and camels and everything. And he said that Ulai Yisa Panav, perhaps he will Yisa Panav, perhaps he'll look on me favorably. So Yisa Panav means to look on somebody with favor. And so we're asking God, may God look to you with favor, vayasem lecha shalom, and grant you wholeness, grant you shalom, not peace, but shlemut, wholeness.
Wholeness.
In other words, it's an aggregate. It's an aggregate blessing which includes the previous two. May you have the wholeness of the intellectual blessing and the wholeness of the material blessing. May God be pleased with you as a personality of who you are, and grant you wholeness of being, material, intellectual, and emotional. The commentary of this, JPS commentary of this blessing, notes in its structure that it has a particular poem. It's like a poem, a structured poem. It has 3 words, then 5 words, and then 7 words. And the consonants are 15 consonants, 20 consonants, and 25. In other words, the words are very carefully chosen and structured so that one builds on the other. The first and last kola of the poem are exactly the same length, 7 syllables, and they form an envelope which summarizes the essence. The first part of each line invokes God's movement towards us, like Yivarechecha Hashem, and then the second part is his activity on our behalf. Yivarechecha Hashem, but also may he v'yishmerecha, or Ya'er Hashem panav elecha, but also v'yichuneka, and Yisa Hashem panav elecha, and also v'yasem lecha shalom. So it's a very structured blessing, which is designed as a rising crescendo. 3, 5, and 7. It's on a base. Yisa Hashem panav elecha is the base on which the other 2 are included. May God bless you and preserve you. May he give you your needs and allow you to enjoy them. May God grant you his knowledge and grace you with the ability to understand and appreciate it. And may God look on you as a whole person with favor and grant you wholeness. May he be pleased with you as a personality and grant the wholeness of material, intellectual, and emotional blessings. Okay, so that is the Birkat Kohanim. And that's the words that you hear when you hear the Birkat Kohanim, and you sort of close your eyes and look down, then try to remember what these blessings are and feel that the Kohanim are transmitting God's blessing to each person when you hear the words come through.
Thank you. That's a great breakdown, Steve. Excellent.